Welcome to the Read, Talk, Grow podcast, where we explore women's health topics through books. In the same way that books can transport us to a different time, place, or culture, Read, Talk, Grow demonstrates how books can also give a new appreciation for health experiences and provide a platform from which women's health can be discussed. At Read, Talk, Grow, we use books to learn about health conditions in the hopes that we can all lead happier, healthier lives. I'm your host, Dr. Denise Millstine. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic in Arizona, where I practice women's health, internal medicine, and integrative medicine. I am always reading and I love discussing books with my patients, my professional colleagues, and now with you. So I'm so excited to introduce my two guests. The first is Holly Whitaker, who's a writer, researcher, teacher, student, and the author of the wildly popular New York Times bestseller, Quit Like a Woman. She's the founder of Tempest Inc., an alcohol addiction recovery and support space. She's been working in media beyond her book, including blogging in different spaces, and also her most recent podcast called Quitted. From her website, Holly is a person in long-term recovery who thinks that the key to everything we're looking for individually and societally comes from the work we do on ourselves. Everything starts when we stop running, and because of that, it follows that everyone deserves the opportunity to engage in recovery. Holly, I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
My second guest is Dr. Kristen Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is a board-certified addiction psychiatrist at Park Nicollet. She has experience assisting patients in their recovery in residential and intensive outpatient settings as lead psychiatrist at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. She received advanced training in substance use disorder at UCLA, where she completed a research and clinical addiction psychiatry fellowship. She received a grant to research the unique relationship between substance use disorders and female hormones during her general psychiatry residency at Mayo Clinic. She used her expertise to contribute a chapter in the Assessment and Treatment of Addiction, Best Practices and New Frontiers, as well as the American Psychiatric Association's textbook of substance use disorders published in 2021. Dr. Schmidt, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start with the book. I need to tell you a story. I was in my room, this very room, with a patient recently, and we were talking about she was not feeling herself. She was tired. She was frustrated about weight gain. We're going through the process, and I stopped and I said, "Really, how much are you drinking?" And she opened up to me. And I said, I want you to read Quit Like a Woman, because you have been struggling with this question of, am I an alcoholic? And it's the wrong question to ask. We can see that alcohol is affecting you and it's affecting your health. And we need to find strategies to figure out why you're drinking and how to support you to really look at that and try to change it. So you've joined my prescription pad, Holly. I now am going to keep copies of your book here in my room so I can hand it out. Tell us about how you came to write this book.
I mean, that's such a long story. I mean, essentially, I started drinking in my teens, and I think like the messaging that most of us get, we're supposed to be able to drink, and there's something wrong with you if you can't make alcohol work. I had a lot of childhood trauma, and I never really had a healthy relationship with alcohol, but I also never had what would qualify as addiction. I drank excessively, and that kind of ebbed and flowed throughout my teens and into college, and then through my early professional life. And then around 2009, as I was working at a startup in healthcare, my drinking just went off the rails. I had a breakup. I was working a ridiculous number of hours. I was in startup culture. I was living in San Francisco, and I was surrounded by so much drinking and so much messaging that drinking was normal. It's really interesting within a healthcare organization how much the messaging was work hard, play hard. And I followed that script. secretly, I had an eating disorder that I'd really never dealt with. It developed in my, like going back to when I was 11. I had collected all of these, maladaptive behaviors in order to deal with things I'd never healed. And then around this time between 2009 and 2012, it just, shot off. I was binging and purging. I was, drinking excessively. I was using pot excessively. I was smoking and working a lot. And for me, I spent a really long time terrified. There was something wrong. There was something so clearly wrong. And you could see this objectively, but also being in that, when you're looking at the markers of what we imagine alcohol addiction looks like, you're like, maybe it's not that bad, right? Like you kind of waffle. And that really was my existence. And we created this framework at Tempest that helps us identify where people are in the stages of recovery. And I was in what we'd call the ether, which was you just are not aware. And it feels wild from this vantage point to realize that. But so for me, I spent a long time absolutely not wanting to have alcohol addiction because of what I believed it would mean for my life, my quality of life, my social life, my friendships, how I fit into society, all of the things that you look at and you think you'll lose, that I'd have to be going to meetings forever, that I would probably end up dying from it. And I think that there was a turning point when I just got exhausted in mid 2012. And late 2012, there was just this breaking point and I could no longer deny it. I was too tired from everything I was doing to myself. Kind of by the grace of God, I ended up finding a book that was called, and this is why books are so important. And I love this podcast because I had all this access to healthcare and to whatever I needed. And still, it was a book that was the thing that absolutely changed my mind. And I found this book by Alan Carr called The Easy Way to Control Alcohol. And it's so interesting because it's the only book I could have imagined reading because it was about keeping alcohol in my life. Because again, we have this societal value, this currency on alcohol, and we think it's so important and we have to make it work, which I think is changing now. I read that book and that book essentially said the only way to control alcohol really is to not use it. And it also really flipped the script for me. It was like, not about no longer, not being able to drink, but not having to drink. And that was like a breath of fresh air. Like, I don't have to do this to myself. And that really was the start of it. So I wrote the book essentially because of that, because I for me, really personally, what I felt was missing within the space of recovery was this desirability. When I started to get sober, there was no desirability that was included. Like, it wasn't aspirational. It also didn't necessarily meet people where they were at. I really wanted to help people move around the idea that they had to call themselves alcoholics. But, there's 1,000 other reasons that we can get into. But it was, essentially because I felt the healthcare system absolutely failed when it came to meeting addiction. It was because I felt, especially for women, we have these models of care and frameworks of recovery that were created in the 30s that still persist, that largely ignore not just women, but individuals at intersections of other marginalized identities. There's so much. And because we're still lacking in this idea of like holistic integrative recovery, like people are still referred outright just to 12-step meetings, which are great for some people, but that doesn't count for holistic care. So there's a lot.
I'm so thrilled that you talked about the importance of books because one of the things that I think is so important is that books are private and they are accessible to anybody who has access to a library. You literally can get them for free. So, a lot of women's health care topics are very intimate, very personal, and that you can step into that space without necessarily selecting first who you're going to talk to about it or which direction you're going to do, that you can start to explore the topic. So, thank you for mentioning Alan Carr's book and, of course, for writing your own book. Kristen, you have such an interesting area of expertise in psychiatry. I wish we could clone you and have thousands of you. The system needs thousands of you, but tell us how you chose to go into addiction psychiatry.
I come from a long line of females who are in recovery, and I myself am also in recovery. And I actually remember, one night I was driving and I saw a woman who was on the street in Minnesota in the winter, which is probably like 20 below. And she was all by herself. She fell over. She was a very young woman, probably, maybe 5 years younger than me at the time. And I remember just identifying with her so strongly and being concerned about her safety. And by that point, I was already into my recovery. I stopped the car and brought her into my car. And at first, I could tell she was pretty embarrassed. She said, "Oh, I just tripped," but I knew she was intoxicated. I could smell it. And I could also hear what was in her purse. And I just said, "No judgment here. Where do you need to go? Let's get you where you need to go safely." And at that point, I really felt this was my purpose. And what I really responded to in Holly's work was this question of purpose. And this really is the fundamental question when we're dealing with any kind of destructive behavior. It's so important that people find what their purpose is, and people are so dissociated from that there's all these forms of escapism. Holly spoke to this idea of binge drinking, and it's the most common form of problematic drinking that we have. Most people are not severe alcohol use disorder folks. Most people are drinking in a problematic way that puts them in situations of harm, basically abstracts them from their potential and their purpose. And so, I think the binge drinking culture really is a reflection of our ambivalence. Holly points out that alcohol is a poison. That's a fact. And it's this sort of open secret in our culture that, yes, it's a poison like tobacco, but we're really comfortable with using this poison. And to go against what the majority of society is saying in terms of, get comfortable learning to drink, use this in social situations, that is such a challenge. And it takes such a strong sense to go against all of society. I have many patients who their problem is binge drinking. It's interfering with their potential, and they vacillate between, do I stop or do I continue? Because has this problem gotten too bad for me to leave my friends behind, right? I'm just so grateful that Holly's written this book, because I, like you, now I have something to especially give my female patients who are struggling with this question of, do I have a problem? Do I not? And they have a way to reconcile it on their own before they maybe move to the next step.
I think that we often consider some of the more classic health impacts of alcohol use. You mentioned this woman who was in a dangerous situation, whether that be exposed to the cold or just unsafe for the people who are around her. Of course, people think about cirrhosis and liver disease related to alcohol. Of course, as well, the liver is very redundant. So that's a really late change of heavy drinking. And Holly, you mentioned just one drink affects your health, and give us this laundry list of ways that it impacts your health, which includes sleep and your mental health, your memory, your ability to concentrate, your ability to metabolize the other things that you put in your body. Can you both talk about these possibly less recognized impacts of alcohol on health?
One of the things that I think is so ridiculous about it is it's a depressant, and it also fuels anxiety. And I think those are the two things, because we look at it as something that relieves both of those things, that relieves boredom or brings joy, or something that also like you wind down with. But because of how alcohol works as a depressant, but also because of the way the body responds to it, it also then fuels you with all of the things that produce anxiety. And when you look across women and the demographic, and the two of you will know this a lot better than I do, but women have the lion's share of depression and anxiety. And so when we're told and we're sold this substance that actually exacerbates those things, and it's wild. For years, I have watched a lot of like influencers or individuals that have written books on, mental health issues. They'll integrate alcohol into their feeds. It's still so disconnected from those things, along with all the things you mentioned, like that, like just from how it makes us appear to like premature aging, to the way it disrupts our hormones, to any number of things.
No, I agree. I mean, the anxiety, the depression, the sleep is really disrupted. They do this thing called dry January, where I don't know if you've heard about this, people basically try and take the month to reset as an attempt to figure out what alcohol is actually doing in their lives. And we know that even within 2 weeks, when we have people at a treatment center, their liver enzymes improve dramatically within just 2 weeks. People are sleeping better. They're not requiring sleep medications. Their mood, specifically females, tend to use to address negative affect. So negative affect, stress improves, the sort of reactivity to life stressors, to interpersonal stressors, all of that improves. And just the ability to engage, right? You have a lot of social anxiety as well when people are in this habit of drinking and then recovering in the morning, right? And not wanting to talk to friends or avoid coworkers. All of that kind of social anxiety improves when people put the substance away.
And one big one that we didn't list yet is cancer. So alcohol is a known carcinogen. We recently interviewed Claire Pooley, who wrote The Sober Diaries, which is another incredible book about the journey of deciding to stop drinking. And in her year that she's stopped drinking, she develops breast cancer. And we know that alcohol is associated with breast cancer, among others, but that's obviously an important cancer for women. We've mentioned a bit about the culture of alcohol being normal, but there's also a specific culture directed at women. I was in a bookstore yesterday, and the tea towels and the t-shirts and the decorated wine glasses. Let's talk a little bit about that and its impact.
Well, I think what's interesting, when I was researching the book, probably in 2018, one of my friends sent me this article about cigarettes and encouraged me to look at the trajectory of cigarettes and how they became ubiquitous. And then also they became, universally despised within our society. And it was fascinating because one of the articles he sent me was this piece about how PR agencies in the early 1900s, when women were not smoking as much as men were, cigarette companies essentially co-opted feminism and like the women's lib movement in order to sell cigarettes. And so they did this by basically finding feminists, giving them a cigarette, taking pictures of them and putting them in the newspapers. So one of the biggest taboos at that time, purity culture, women, if they were smoking, they were doing it out of the public sight. And so what they did was they used conspicuous consumption and splash these photos of these like very sexy, young feminists smoking cigarettes. And they called them torches of freedom, right? The idea that a cigarette was this like symbol that you were the new woman essentially promoted other women to smoke, right? And they did this, they smoked and they used cigarettes as this symbol of like feminist rebellion. And you still know that. We still know that imagery. Also know that PR agencies back in the 1900s used cigarettes on film in order to convey what words could not. And so cigarettes were used to show like relaxation or nervousness or, sinisterness, depending on how they smoked them. The alcohol industries co-opted the same idea, right? We know alcohol is a symbol of, we can see it in ads, like especially from like the 60s and 70s, that like drinking a whiskey neat says a specific thing about you. So the same type of imagery and conspicuous consumption and like what it said about you is tied in and wrapped in with alcohol consumption. And so drinking alcohol is a sign of being sexy, or it's just like depending on what alcohol you drink. And it's across all film, it's across all media. And so the messaging that we get, and Jean Kilburn did an incredible job highlighting this in multiple books that she wrote. But the idea is that over time, we have been given all of these symbols and these images through marketing, through film, through media, and now through social media, where we're showing each other how we use alcohol. And so what's erupted is this normalization that drinking solves everything and that we're doing it all the time. And I do think that there's more awareness now, a little bit. But at the height of this, when I was researching my book, I mean, it was just like, there was like social media posts of a woman with a barbell and she's lifting weights and she's like drinking alcohol that's attached to the barbell, drinking copious amounts of alcohol, like toxic amounts of alcohol is normalized. You know, we're drinking at book clubs, we're drinking at weddings, we're drinking on dates, we're drinking on vacation. Like drinking is our reward. It fixes everything. It's what stressed out to their end of the rope moms use. It's something that, you know, my sister, who is not a heavy drinker, when her kid turned 3 and she started going to all of these different functions, she was like, oh my God, the pressure to drink during the day or all the time with these moms is so real. It kind of like started small, but really, I think the alcohol industry has ingeniously co-opted all that, the work that the tobacco industry did for them in creating this like symbolism around alcohol. But then also, I think really with social media and the way that all of us are kind of piling on in this concept of how we use alcohol and how important it is, really sends this message that women need to drink alcohol basically all the time, and a lot of it.
I would say that that's 100% true, and that we're socialized, especially as, you know, young females, until you become pregnant. And I remember in medical school, I did some research on pregnancy and alcohol use, and then I extended that when I was in my residency looking at rats. But what I did was I set up all these images. I remember I was presenting, you know, as a young med student, this presentation, and I had all these sexy images of these women with alcohol, and all of my preceptors were watching. And I continued to roll through these images. And then all of a sudden I had an image of a pregnant belly and a woman with a drink. And it was like, you could almost hear an audible gasp, because it's suddenly we can drink. And then the body becomes sacred as the mother when the baby's inside. And then suddenly there's a hard brake pedal. And then a woman, if she drinks, she's shamed. But then once the baby's out, get back to it. And this is where, you know, some of the research was exciting for me, because I found all these old studies of women who had struggled with alcohol use disorders. They became pregnant and suddenly they were able to stop drinking. And it wasn't just the social messaging, because you and I know if someone really struggles with an alcohol problem, I'd have male gynecologists tell me when I was starting this research project, well, but it's because women get nauseous during pregnancy, so that's why they stop. And I know plenty of people who have alcohol use disorder who will throw up and then go right back to the bar to continue drinking, because that's part of the problem. And it turns out that there is a hormonal component specifically for females during pregnancy, beyond pregnancy, that could play a role in why females are able to stop drinking. They've been able to show that, you know, I did a study with rats where basically we got them drinking, alcohol dependent. And then as soon as these rats became pregnant, those same rats stopped drinking, and I got to see it. And then we measured some of their hormone levels. We looked at something called orexin, which is responsible for alertness, arousal, and some other things. And we found that the orexin was decreased in these rats once they became pregnant, and it correlated with their alcohol use titration. So we also know that there's tons of studies looking at progesterone and allopregnanolone, which is basically a metabolite of progesterone, in women with cocaine use disorder, methamphetamine use disorder, nicotine use disorder. And what they found is if you give not only women, but males 400 milligrams of progesterone, they will have reduced urges to smoke or use these stimulants, their cognition improves, their negative affect improves. So there really is a hormonal piece to all of this that could at least be helpful as another tool in terms of getting women and even men help in terms of quitting some of their substance use disorders.
That is so brilliant and exciting.
It
right?
is. Yeah.
It's like a natural anti-abuse or something.
Exactly. Our body knows what to do. Estrogen really fuels the alcohol use. And there's plenty of studies with that it helps with rewarding alcohol. And then progesterone really is, and allopregnanolone, they're kind of the yin and the yang. So it's an exciting new area.
And I wonder if this will shed any light on, because I think like it's so interesting. A lot of like women that I've worked with that are coming into recovery are either at the stage where perimenopause onsets and like they have to kind of pull apart, is this perimenopause or is this recovery? And then also I wonder in recovery, as people are trying to quit drinking, if like any of the research will like shine a light on like how your cycle affects your cravings. Obviously, there's no research done in this area, right? Like there's so little, like when it comes to like how drinking affects women. I mean, we know from like the vaccine that there was so little research done on what it did to our cycles. And I wonder what this will yield. That's so exciting.
Yeah, it is a very exciting kind of area of research that's exploding, and they're really trying to give a lot more money to female researchers who are doing this work, because the reason why many women were excluded from studies in general, for instance, aspirin, the 81 milligram aspirin a day, no females were involved in that study, none. And the reason why is because we cycle. And so they couldn't control for that variable. So they just excluded women altogether. But things are changing, but we definitely need much more work in that direction.
I just want to comment on the pregnancy association, but then, and I'm quite a bit older than the two of you, but like you mentioned, Holly, with the perimenopause and menopause, women do become much more sensitive to alcohol. And because menopause and perimenopause don't have a defining moment, right? There's no positive pregnancy test. It's just that your hormones start to become less predictable, but that many women in their late 40s and into their 50s find all the health effects that we have mentioned about alcohol, even if it's a low level of drinking alcohol, have huge effects on their mood, their sleep, all of the other things that we mentioned.
Yeah. I just wanted to take a moment to step back to what you were talking about, Kristen, which was that all these pictures that we love of like the maidens, like drinking alcohol, and then the second they become mothers, it's so taboo. I just want to put a pin in that because I think it's so absolutely important. There is no one that's made more of a monster than a woman who is pregnant, who drinks or does something to her baby, because she's absolutely not valued in our society. And so I think like just to any woman who has been pregnant, is struggling with alcohol use disorder, I just want to like make clear you are not a monster and you deserve all the compassion, all the empathy, all the support that anybody else would deserve that is dealing with what you're dealing with. And then there was a study, I think there was, I don't know if anybody picked up on the prime minister or a PM in Europe, I can't remember what country, and she was seen partying. And it reminded me of the study that was done a few years ago that showed when men have, alcohol in their hand, what's assumed of them. And when a woman has a drink in her hand, what's assumed in her. And I was just reading the study last night, and I can't remember it specifically, but just essentially like a woman holding a beer makes her seem more sexually available, discredits her trustworthiness. It's just wild, these things. And I think they're really important to call out because they absolutely do affect why we use substances in the first place and how we recover.
Right. I just want to make clear too, that there are lots of women who, when they're pregnant, they still struggle with the substance use disorder. And so the thought is if we can find, is there a hormonal component? The best thing we can do is add some hormonal, whether it's progesterone or it's metabolite, to be able to add that to a woman's milieu as she's carrying the baby to help her in terms of the substance use disorder and craving. That may be the best thing we can do for both her and her baby, because her body already makes it naturally. And so there wouldn't be the kinds of consequences that can come with other medications or any concern for fetal harm. So
Can we talk specifically about wine? I think, Holly, you do such a good job talking about how you became a wine expert when you were
Yeah.
this young professional, and also how you go to a gathering when you've stopped drinking and it's really, shoved in your face. Can we just talk specifically about wine? Because I feel that's a very big
Mhm.
women's issue.
Yeah, I mean, in my book, I talk about how I went to school in San Luis Obispo and Santa Cruz, which are both huge wine regions. My early career was in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, which again, like huge influence of like wine country there. It's hard to talk about this because I think I lived in such a specific area and I had such a personal attachment to the status that was attached. Wine bars were just a new thing in California. And I started going to them and learning about all these different wines. But I talked about it in my book specifically that I dominated wine. Like it was part of having a wine collection or being able to tell the difference between wines or knowing how to order a bottle for my table. All these things were things I trained in. And it's really funny because when I stopped drinking, because of how I stopped drinking, a lot of my process involved, I had a full spectrum recovery, meaning I had social, spiritual, psychological, physiological supports. But specifically around this like flip in it, it was so interesting because alcohol was so important to me. And like the people that I hung out with, it became ridiculous to me because it's a liquid in a bottle. And yes, like I don't want to discount the fact that like ceremonially, like I'm not anti-drug, right? I think like drugs have been around forever. Alcohol is a drug. There have been ceremonial uses and cultural uses of alcohol for thousands and thousands of years, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about late stage capitalism, excess consumption. No one's using it ceremonially in the United States. It's just a liquid in a bottle and all the import we give to it. And it was so interesting because I had one of my really close friends at the time, his family lived in Oregon. His parents wanted me to like marry him. They promised me my own wine cellar if like we were to get together. He had a wine cellar in his home and a wine fridge. He lived in San Francisco, so he had smaller apartments and he had so much alcohol that he had offsite storage for it. I remember being so impressed by that. And then it just was ridiculous. I'm like, the flip in the value of it was just, oh my God, like how much money and time and effort. And it's just spoiled grape juice.
Claire Pooley talks in her book about how she was buying the nicer bottle of wine. And that's
Yeah,
how she justified that she didn't have a problem because she wasn't
sure.
buying that
'Cause
bottom
it's
shelf.
fancy.
Exactly. Switching gears a bit, I think the importance of community and learning how to build that community when a lot of your social interaction or even what's numbed you is alcohol. Can you both talk about how important that is and strategies that women who are looking at this might employ to intentionally build a healthy community around them?
I would say in terms of the community piece that it is especially helpful for women. We do know that females tend to be relational in terms of their use. So a lot of times what gets them sick is relationships. So whether that's a relationship with an intimate partner, whether it's a negative relationship in terms of their workplace, we do know that if a female has a partner who's been using, specifically, there was a study done in terms of like injecting heroin. And what they found was that while 51% of males learn to inject by a friend, 90% of females are injected by their male partner. And so that sort of relational pattern of use keeps females using longer. So if you can kind of flip that and have a sense of positive community, that really helps women get sober. And I know Shelley Greenfield has done a lot of work on this. She's out at Harvard and she developed a whole program, a women's recovery manual looking at female concerns, childcare concerns, really gearing community groups to address female problems. The outcomes from those have been much more positive for females. And much of that has to do with the approach. It's a very supportive approach, non-confrontational, and they really work on using affiliative statements so that females feel really good. I know in Holly's book, she really speaks to the voicelessness and how difficult it can be for some women in the 12-step community to feel a voice because it was predicated upon, older white males addressing their problem. Not to say that women can't get sober with the 12-step recovery, because I've seen that, but some women certainly don't feel that that's an appropriate place for them to get what they need. So really finding a community of women for women is very important.
I'd add to that too. Whenever anybody asks that question, I think about how hard it was for me to find community where I really felt like I belonged. And so I kind of want to take the opposite approach to also say it's hard to find community. It just is. It doesn't matter how many different programs we create or how many spaces there are. A lot of times people that are struggling with addiction are naturally introverts, or they're naturally socially anxious, and they use alcohol in order to break down barriers between them and other individuals. And so I think a lot about Bruce Alexander's work. So Bruce Alexander coined or framed this dislocation model of addiction. Bruce Alexander is famous for doing the Rat Park experiments, but he also wrote this book called The Globalization of Addiction. And one of the theses of his book was that fully integrated individuals were, first of all, completely accepted for who they were as individuals and fit into a society because of who they were, no matter what they were, meaning they were fully individuated, but also fully accepted based on their own unique expression. And I think of that a lot because I think that so much of what my own development, I'm rich in community. I have many, many, many tight relationships, and that has been a foundation of my recovery. I didn't go that traditional route of walking into a room, of getting hugs from 100 people, and I've seen that, and I know the power of that, and I didn't have that, and I couldn't access that because the rooms I was walking into made me feel completely messed up and scared and worked against my recovery. So I think it's really important to also state in this that part of when I think of community building and belonging, I think it's also this community building and belonging within the self. We're always looking for externals. And for me, a lot of my work came down to finding community within myself, being with myself as enough. I couldn't be alone. I didn't know how to be alone and to be sober. And so I had to do a lot of friendship building with myself, learning to be alone in the sense where I wasn't alone. Those two processes, as well as putting myself out there and trying different forms of community that weren't necessarily sobriety based. I did yoga teacher trainings. I went to meditation classes. Those were the two primary ways for me, right? Finding community at first was through places I was already going to, but a lot of it was also a lot of internal work. And I think those two things, as I got more comfortable within myself, as I expressed this different version of myself, that allowed me to develop bonds in community with people that were meeting me at that different version of myself that I couldn't have connected with necessarily when I was drinking. I always think of the woman who writes me and says, I'm all alone. I have no community. I've tried. There's something wrong with me. I find that to be the predominant more than I have this great community that's helping me develop relationships. And I think to her, I say that's okay too. There's stuff that you can do. It's not a deficiency that you're not able to find community because our world is fractured and community is really hard to find.
I really like that. And I think also you can find community even within your own family, people who have children. When you're using substances, you're totally disconnected, right? You're not present. Right. And right. So a lot of my patients feel so good coming home in terms of, gosh, they're able to really recognize and establish those bonds again with their children or with their close friends or with their partner. Some of that really is the community that had been lacking as well. So it's important to recognize that piece. You don't need to go out and make 100 new friends. Sometimes you just really have to devote time to, nurturing exactly what you have.
Yeah. And I think I love that, because that was really important to me too, which was reestablishing connection that was so severed because of my addiction. It reminds me of all the different qualities of relationships that I built, because it was the reestablishment within the relationships that existed. And also the relationships with individuals that knew what I had been through, because my family couldn't meet the need of being able to understand anything about what I've been through. That reestablishment of relationships that existed in connection to the present moment and being able to show up. You're right. It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You make a really good point about connecting to the self and the difference between solitude and loneliness or isolation, that it's okay to be by yourself as long as you're not feeling that struggle and that pull. And another form of community I'll throw out is having a pet. The hormonal changes of having, I think you're a cat person, Holly, and a cat or a dog, just connecting with another being. It doesn't have to be hundreds of people, and it doesn't have to look like this picture perfect social life like we are also being fed on social media. So
my therapist was my original community. That was my first sense of belonging in recovery, and being seen was with the person I paid,
having a place where you can be your authentic self. Yeah. Even if it's in a context of a relationship like that. Absolutely.
Holly, you also took all of that energy and passion and gosh, you read such amazing books. I've got a whole book list now after reading your book of things that I want to read. And I remember having a friend in college who told me that James Joyce is your friend, Kristen. Virginia Woolf is your friend. And really those books and those authors, I mean, they can change your life, right? They can change your life. And I mean, you can't discount that. And I have one of my wonderful patients. She told me, look, I'm not doing AA. She said, I'm talking to some of the women from treatment. I'm not getting a sponsor. But what I'm doing is I'm going to school, and I've been sober a year. And I say, God bless it. However you get there, but that's a way to connect. That's a way to connect to yourself too, through the medium of an author's voice and your own intellect, right?
My friend Courtney Mom is a novelist and memoirist, and she writes a newsletter about writing. And she was just saying the other day that a really good memoir or a good book is a conversation between the author and the reader. And I mean, when I was getting sober, I found Gabby Bernstein's work. She's like a new age person. I read this line, and she had clearly had eating stuff and clearly had, drug use stuff. And she was saying that she was addicted to, I think, gossip and Subway sandwiches. And so was I. And I thought I was the only one that had a thing with Subway. It was just this recognition and this coming home. And when I met her, it just was such a big deal to me. And I realize now when people meet me and I remember that, because when I met her, I had this intimate, deep relationship, and it was very one-sided, right? I think it absolutely is. And you bring up this other point, which is part of my recovery was throwing myself into, my energy went into building, what I built and writing what I write.
Well, and I think that's a great point for us to end on, is that many times we think about when people stop drinking, what they're losing, and really pivoting to look at what you gain when you get back all of that time and energy and better quality sleep when you stop drinking, how it can crack open your life into avenues that perhaps you hadn't allowed yourself to dream about prior to that point. This has been an amazing conversation among amazing women to talk about a topic that can be really difficult to face. I just want to express such gratitude for the book love that we shared today, but really for the authentic conversation on a difficult topic and for the work that both of you do for this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Absolutely.
Millstine and Dr. Schmidt. It's really
Yeah.
been a pleasure being here with both of you.
Thank you for joining us to talk books and health today on Read, Talk, Grow. To continue the conversation and send comments, visit the show notes or email us at readtalkgrow@mayo.edu. Read, Talk, Grow is a production of Mayo Clinic Press. Our producer is Lisa Speckhard-Pask, and our recording engineer is Rick Andreessen. The podcast is for informational purposes only and is not designed to replace a physician's medical assessment and judgment. Information presented is not intended as medical advice. Please contact a healthcare professional for medical assistance with specific questions pertaining to your own health if needed. Keep reading, everyone.